Good evening, everyone, and welcome to New York Buddha Dharma. We have a lot of noise. Is that the radiator? Oh, it's the steam kettle. Thanks. Excuse me. So tonight, we're going to go over the last of the death bardos. This is the bardos and the teachings of what happens after one dies and then is reborn. Just to recap on the death bardos, the first of these, which is actually still in the bardo in the time of one's life, but it's sometimes called a death bardo, is the painful bardo of dying. And that describes, and we've already gone through that in a previous evening, the death of the physical body and then the death of the mental or subtle body. And it culminates with, with the death of the physical body. That's when Western medicine normally pronounces a person dead. The heart stops and brain activity ceases. But from a Buddhist perspective, there's still more to go, as the mental events that constitute the neurotic mind, ego mind, shut down. First, those associated with aggression move down the central channel to the heart. Those associated with passion move up from the secret center to the heart. And when they meet at the heart, as they move down, there's a white light that the person experiences. And then as the thoughts of passion connected with passion move up, there's a red light like the sky at dawn that the person experiences. And then when they meet at the heart, the thoughts associated with ignorance also cease, and there is every blackness. And there is a moment of complete shutdown of the neurotic mind, and at that point all that is left is the mind of enlightenment itself, luminosity, the ground of luminosity, because neurotic mind has ceased. And if this is actually the entrance into the next bardo, what's called the bardo of reality, the Churni bardo in Tibetan, or the bardo of Dharmata, to use the Sanskrit word. And this bardo has two phases, according to the Nyingma sect. It's a little different with the Kagyus, but not much. The first phase is that with the complete shutdown of ego mind, of all these mental events, there is an opportunity to recognize what amounts to the Dharmakaya luminosity. This is the fundamental ground of reality, in which nothing has any true existence. Sometimes it's called kadak, alpha pure, is the way that's translated into English often. And they say that at this point, if the practitioner has practiced enough, that means they've done a lot of practice in this life, especially the practice of resting in the nature of mind, which is pretty much kind of what we were doing here tonight. It's the beginning of that, at least. That if a person has done enough of that, they will recognize this luminosity as it appears, as it is revealed, and the person can achieve full enlightenment through recognition of what is real. Now, there's an analogy for this. They say, there are many analogies actually, but the one that comes up a lot is that it's the mother-child luminosity. And what that means is that the mother is the real thing. The child is all the preparation you've done in your lifetime, preparing to see reality. And there's always, when you are practicing, a slight, or not, could be gross, but even when you get to be a really fine practitioner, there might be a slight element of self-consciousness. Now I'm practicing. The watcher is there, viewing. And that's the fundamental and subtle trace of ego. That's why they call it the child luminosity, because it's not fully developed into ultimate reality. And when that ultimate reality dawns, the child luminosity, all that practice, can recognize it and become one with it. And they say that it's like a child leaping into its mother's lap. That's why they call it the mother-child luminosity. Now, failing that, if one doesn't recognize that ground luminosity, then one moves on, the individual moves on, and things are beginning to come back, but it's still not neurotic mind. Now what comes is the second phase of the Bardo of reality, which is that one is seeing Sambhogakaya realm. So this is still within the realm of reality. These two realms, Sambhogakaya and Dharmakaya, are the reality bodies of the Buddha. And the Sambhogakaya realm that the practitioner might view first appears as the heavens, in which are populated by Buddhas. Also, the person will see the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities. These, again, are enlightened figures. And all of this appears in a radiant rainbow light that is actually so brilliant that it's hard to look at. And the practitioner has the opportunity again to achieve enlightenment by recognizing all of these manifestations as the manifestations of mind, projections out. They're not separate from, there's no I or other, no you who is the viewer. It's all arising in the middle of reality. These projections of the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities and the Buddhas of all the different heavens. Now, if the person fails to recognize that, then they move on from that out of the Bardo of reality and into the Bardo, which is the subject of tonight's talk, the Bardo of becoming. Most people do not recognize either of these two Bardos because they haven't practiced. And even among practitioners, people who have practiced a lot, they may not recognize this because they simply haven't received the appropriate instructions. It's very important to have pointing out instruction from a realized master, and it's very important to have practiced and seen some of this in one's lifetime so that one can recognize it during the Bardo of reality at the time of death. Failing that recognition, one then moves on into the Bardo of becoming, and this is the Bardo that 99.99% of the world's population of sentient beings experience immediately at the point of death. They go right from the end of the Bardo of painful Bardo of dying, when the mind and the body have completely shut down. Now everybody sees these two, the Bardo of reality, but if the person isn't trained, it will go by in such a blink that they don't even notice it. All sentient beings experience it, from the lowest microbe to the most advanced intelligence. But without the training to recognize it, they won't. And they go straight into the Bardo of becoming. So most people who you know who are going to pass, that's where they go, within a split second of dying. Or there's a period of time after death when the person hangs around, the spirit, the consciousness hangs around the body, they say for 3.5 days. And during that time, you, the living survivors, are enjoined to sit with the body and to communicate with the dead person and to let them know you're dead. And to be cheerful, because you don't want to freak the person out, to sort of be loving, to be their friend, and not weeping and wailing. But at some point the person will move on, and they'll move on into the bardo of becoming. And they won't have recognized, they will have seen it, but not recognized the bardo of reality because it went by in such a blink. And in fact, it's here all the time for all of us, and we're not noticing it because we're just so consumed with our thoughts and our assumptions of what the world is. And really, our training ultimately will prepare us to see it in this lifetime, or at least at the moment of death. And we could talk about the kind of trainings there are that can help us do it. Some people, if they train enough, will see it in this lifetime, and for them there are no bardos. If you see it in this lifetime, if you achieve enlightenment in this lifetime, there are no bardos of death, or the bardo of reality, or the bardo of becoming. At any point, when a person recognizes what reality actually is, which is the transcendence, the cutting through of I and other, then at that point, there are no more bardos. The journey is over. But, as I say, for most people, the bardo of becoming is the experience. And this is what is, perhaps you've heard of the 49-day period from death to rebirth. That's it. That is the bardo of becoming, the 49-day period. They say that it lasts 49 days. Now, this is figuratively speaking, because in death, there is no sun and moon, there's no material world, so there are no literal 24-hour days. It's a figure of speech. And in fact, in the earlier bardos, the bardo of reality, sometimes they talk about it lasting for a certain number of meditation days. A meditation day is the amount of time that you can spend present without lapsing into dream. So if you can spend 5 minutes just resting here in awareness, that's one meditation day. And they say that there are different numbers of meditation days for the bardo of reality. One such as 13, that you last 13 meditation days, and then you pass on into the next bardo, unless you have recognized reality, achieved enlightenment, and then the bardos cease. So we have no recognition, most people, of the luminous bardo of reality. That's what it's called, the luminous bardo of reality, full of these. You see what the bardo of reality is about. One can see it now. But in order to see it now, the world is transformed. And what we take to be this veil of tears, populated by ordinary sentient beings, is actually a heavenly palace full of gods and goddesses, if one has the eyes to see. These gods and goddesses may not know that they're gods and goddesses. They've lost track, like we have. They've fallen into dream. But they are, nonetheless, the stuff of divinity. So we wake up in the bardo of becoming, and we wonder what has happened to us and where we are. And we're like a child that can't find its mother. Literally, there's that feeling of being, where am I? And who do I relate to? And who's going to take care of me? And how do I find some measure of security? And all of that. And one more time, we have to make a lonely journey and wander in confusion, looking for solace, looking for peace. And we're doing it again. This is what happens when one wakes up in the bardo of bardo of becoming. In this bardo, we can become anything depending upon our past karma. Karma is all of the habits of mind, the inclinations and proclivities that have been stored in your unconscious. So, I've given lots of examples of this, or a few anyhow. The one that I use a lot is of the child who was bitten by a dog. And this memory is stored in the child's alaya. It's called the alaya, the storehouse. And that memory lies dormant there as the child goes on and lives a life, until suddenly the child encounters another dog, and then that memory of the trauma springs to life again. That's karma. And it figures in that other people may not even notice the dog that the child is seeing, but the child that's the reality for that person. We see what we are conditioned by our past experiences and training to see. And we see the world through the lens of what we like and don't like from our pasts. And each one of us is seeing a different version of the world because of our pasts. And what happens in the Bardo of Becoming is that the past comes to the fore. Again, it comes out of the Alaya, just like it does at night when you dream. In fact, the Bardo of Becoming is very like a dream that you might have at night. It can change in an instant what you're dreaming. Just 1 minute you can be in Tucson, Arizona, and the next minute you're in Anchorage. Just instantaneously. 1 minute you can be young, the next minute you can be old. All kinds of things can happen. We can go from a pleasant dream to a horrific one in a blink of an eye, because it's all mental. Also, they say that in the Bardo of Becoming, you are much smarter, 7 times smarter than you were in life. Your mind is much more able to understand languages. You remember things, teachings, in fact, all kinds of things that come back. Your memory is, because it's purely mental. You have nothing to slow the mind down. And there are 2 versions of the Alaya. One is called the Alaya consciousness, or in Sanskrit, the Alaya Vijnana. And the other is called the Alaya Jnana, which means wisdom Alaya, the Alaya storehouse. If one achieves enlightenment, then one is present in the Alaya Jnana, which is the wisdom Alaya. And that's this space which is utterly generative, meaning everything is constantly arising out of space and passing back into it. It's like a giant cornucopia. The space is, or they liken it to a womb, which is continually giving birth. And it's a graveyard, a charnel ground, into which everything is continually dying. Like these words, this gesture. You turn your head, and now I'm looking at Becca, and now I turn my head and I'm looking at Lane. And the world is constantly arising and passing away in this present moment. In the Alaya Jnana. Vijnana, which means conscious, usually translated as consciousness, literally means divided consciousness, divided jnana. And what's it divided into? I and other. And so it's confused. It's the consciousness of confusion, of samsara. This Bardo, the Bardo of Becoming, is, they call this, we've had the Dharmakaya luminosity, which is one of the reality luminosities. We've had the Sambhogakaya luminosity. This is now the Nirmanakaya luminosity. That means the luminosity of manifestation, in which I manifest as me, and you see you manifesting as you, I and other. This is relative reality. Does this ever cease? This constant presentation of manifestations? Never. The space is constantly generating all the 6 knowables, objects of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mind. The only question is, do you recognize them to be non-existent, luminous, passing through? Or do you assume that they are real and that there is a you, an I, here relating to them? In the former case, you're dwelling in reality. In the latter, in samsara, confusion. So the Alaya Vijnana, for most people, as they enter into the Bardo of reality, is producing all this karma, just like dreams do at night. And we could take shape, just as in dreams, in all kinds of things, depending on your past training. You could take take shape in any of the realms. And you could be a hell being, you could be a god, you could be a Wall Street trader, you could be a kitty cat. All kinds of things you can appear as in the Bardo of Becoming, depending on what your past karma is. And a teacher of mine said, the karma that rules is not the most recent karma, necessarily. It's the weightiest karma. So if recently you've committed many good acts, but in the past you've committed atrocities, and you've not yet realized burned up that karma from those, that will come to the fore. It's the weightiest karma that comes first. So there's no predicting. You might have lived an utterly virtuous life and go into death hoping that you're going to have an excellent rebirth, and you might not. There's just no telling. It's all about what lurks back there in the unconscious. I'm using the Freudian term, the unconscious, because it's so much more current, and because it is so similar, ironically, to the 8th century Buddhist term, storehouse consciousness. Freud really, on his own, without knowing anything about Buddhism, recapped what the Buddhists invented how many years ago? 1200 or more. He says here, I'm just quoting from my notes, to the extent that we do not recognize their actual nature, the appearances that we meet at this time in the Bardo, we will take them to be real, to solidly exist as external phenomena, just as we are doing right now. We assume that each one of us exists. Thus they will have the power to terrify, confuse, or seduce us. Those are the three fundamental kleshas, depending on the form they take. What determines the form they take? This is Punlap Rinpoche speaking. It is our habitual patterns, the karmic tendencies we have developed in our life, and indeed throughout our previous lifetimes. Since we have all accumulated many negative tendencies as well as positive ones, our experience now will be mixed and very unpredictable. This is not a happy experience, necessarily. It says at this moment, it is this moment-to-moment sense, we have a moment-to-moment sense of the continuity of me, of I, of a knower. And this becomes the basis for the imputation of a self. And then we are automatically into the whole duality of I and other. And the power of the habitual patterns and the force of our karma comes to play. So in this Bardo, our experience is dominated by karma, by the unceasing manifestation of appearances that arise from the Alaya Vijnana. Now, it's just like now. We're living in the middle of a whole bunch of appearances. Appearances of Becca and Mark, and Marie and this room and all this. And this is our karma. This is the karma that we have accumulated that brought us here tonight to hear this. And it's going to be the same in the Bardo, except that it's more like a dream. It's more out of control. He says, you die, and there's this blackout. And then he says, when we awaken from this blackout and regain some sense of duality, as you do, just like in the morning when you wake up, and you might have been lost in dream, and you say, where am I? Oh yeah, I'm in my room, We begin to have thoughts that we have actually died and left our body. We begin to think that. As we remember our death and come to this understanding, and that's what people can help us do by telling us that we're dead, We are likely to feel intense confusion and anxiety. Fear arises because of our habitual tendencies to cling to this life and to this existence as solid and real. And this is why meditation, the practice of meditation, can help us to prepare us for a better transition through this Bardo. Because simply what we're doing is we're bringing our mind into the present and letting go, seeing the thoughts that arise, thoughts of fear, thoughts of hope and wishfulness, but not reacting to them. If you react to them, you become another kind of thinker. If you say, oh, I don't like that thought, I want to get rid of it, there's a big I in there, and that's a new thought. Instead, what we're enjoined to do in our meditation practice, and this is so important, is to see all the thoughts that arise without judgment, without purpose, without trying to get rid of them. One sees them and they pass away. That's the nature of mind, is to produce thought. And in doing that, in having that kind of gentleness for yourself, you develop compassion for yourself. The compassion that allows you to be just what you are instead of trying to force yourself into some mold, some idea that someone else has given you. And when you develop that kind of compassion to allow yourself to be just what you are, you begin to unwind. And not only that, but you begin to be kinder to other people as well when you're kind to yourself. It is so important in our meditation practice to give up the idea of being thoughtless, to give up judging and punishing ourselves when we think we are having a so-called bad meditation. The keynote throughout all of this is awareness. That's it. Awareness of every single thing, including that. And if you're sitting there thinking, I need to be aware, then you're aware of that. And you don't judge it. You welcome it. You're kind to it. That is so important, that kind of kindness. And it brings cheer. It brings enjoyment. But we tend to be so hard on ourselves. That hardness on ourselves is the ultimate evil in Buddhism. It's called Yelgong, which means victor spirit, conqueror spirit. And it's the spirit of self-attack, self-hatred. And it is regarded as the ultimate and the worst of neurosis. When they talk about wrathful deities, remember I talked about the 100 peaceful, 100 wrathful deities? There are 4 levels of wrath. Wrath is the power of wisdom to cut through confusion. The 4th and ultimate level of wrath is reserved for Gyalgong, which is self-hatred, self-criticism. Isn't that an amazing idea? There's a Padmasambhava. He's sitting up there on the wall of the Tanka Padmasambhava. He has 8 main aspects there. We call them in English. There are manifestations, the way he manifested, and in order to teach and to help sentient beings. One of them is called Dorje Trollo, which literally means indestructible, Dorje, wrathful one. Right? That is the 4th level of wrath. His job, in Dorje Trollo's job, is to not kill, not eradicate, but to butcher the Gyalgongs, the spirit of self-attack, self-hatred, lack of self-trust. It's regarded as the ultimate evil. And what it does is, it at its worst, it produces people who are utterly cruel, not only to themselves, but to others. And I can think of a few abroad in the world today. He says that one of our strongest neurotic habitual tendencies as sentient beings is that of moving, being unstill. We're constantly twitching, either if not physically, mentally. That is said to be the root of all confused habitual tendencies, not abiding or resting within the all basis wisdom, the Alaya Jnana, reality. When you rest in that, it's utterly peaceful because you've stopped judging, stopped trying to get somewhere. You're just seeing it all, witnessing it all. It says, due to the incessant movement of our thoughts, we are continually transported from one place to the next, from one environment to another. It is difficult to remain at rest for any length of time. Everything is vivid and clear in one moment, and in the next we have forgotten everything. When we even forget at times that we have died in the Bardo of Becoming. So, this is a place of miracles. Anything can happen in the Bardo of Becoming. It's all mental, just as in dreams. So if you ever wanted to fly, here's your chance in the Bardo of Becoming. Just as you have, I'm sure many of us, right, have flown in dreams at night and other things. This is a place where if you've practiced a lot in this lifetime, the practices that you've done will come to the fore and are very important. So if you've practiced, for instance, what is usually translated as deity yoga. In deity yoga, you visualize an enlightened figure like Padmasambhava or Vajrayogini or Chakrasamvara. And you visualize that, and you visualize the world of the mandala around them, and you begin to see this world that we live in as that mandala and yourself as that figure. And what you're beginning to do, you see, is step out of this veil of tears mentality and to see the world as enlightened and divine. And that can be, if you've done a lot of that kind of practice, that can help in the Bardo of Becoming. Other practices include that you can do are suppression of kleshas, as in the Hinayana, the beginning stages of the path. There are Mahamudra and Dzogchen practices, although mostly those practices help you recognize the Bardo of reality, Mahamudra. And in fact, what we're doing here when we sit and we do Vipassana practice, that is most useful. That practice ultimately becomes a practice that will help us recognize the Bardo of reality, the Sambhogakaya realm, the realm of reality. Now, in the first part of this Bardo, this dream state, the Bardo of Becoming, you tend to see yourself as you were in your past life. They say, some of the teachings say that you will see yourself, you'll dream yourself, as it were, with the body of a 7-year-old, the 7-year-old child that you were, for roughly the first half of this Bardo. And then you begin to see the Bardo, you begin to imagine the realm into which you're going to be reborn. You have a tendency to gravitate towards a particular realm. If you've got, depending on your karma, if you've got a lot of anger, you might be gravitating towards the hell realm. If you've got a lot of desire, you might be gravitating towards a human realm. And you begin to see your environment in those terms, in terms of the realm that you're going to ultimately inhabit. And this is for the first half, or the 49 days, that you see yourself in terms of what you were in your past life, 7-year-old child, and then you begin to see yourself, or you begin to see the whole environment as more like the realm that you're going to inhabit in your next life. There are two kinds of exceptional beings that don't experience the Bardo, and they're rare. One is people who achieve enlightenment at any stage prior to this Bardo, and they won't experience it. And the other is people whose karma is so bad, so intense, that they go immediately from death into rebirth, into the realm in which they're going to be reborn. They're so powerful, the karma of their mind, the habit of mind. Now, what happens at some point is, just as in the Bardo of reality, you saw the projections of mind as the manifestations of the real. Here you begin to see the projection of your neurotic mind, your karmic mind, your alaya, as projections of the realms. And you begin to see the colors of the realms. So the God realm is white. The jealous God realm is red. And you begin to see a red tinge. And the human realm is blue. And I think I've got the right colors here. White, red, yeah, blue. And then the animal realm has a green glow. And the hungry ghost realm has a yellow glow. And we've been through the realms, I think, at one time or another. And I'm not going to go through it here. It's rich material. And then the hell realm is an ashen light. And according to your karma, again, you will be drawn to one or the other of these lights. You really want to be drawn to the blue light. It's not good to be reborn anything but a human being. Only human beings can tread the path to the Dharma. Any other realm, you're going to have to go through that realm and then be reborn again, ultimately as a human being, before you can tread the Dharmic path again. There are lots of stories. For instance, you could be reborn a god, which is very pleasurable. And there are all these stories, like in the sutras, the early Buddhist teachings, of the Buddha gives teachings and the gods are watching up in heaven, and they're saying things like, they're sort of dumb jocks, the gods. And they're saying, well, I don't really understand what he's saying, but I think he's really great, so I'm going to just rain down some flowers and ambrosia, and they throw it down on him. Because they're so dumb. Gods are very dumb. They're very stupid. They're lost in pleasure. The lower realms, we don't even want to talk about. Those are the realms of real suffering and ignorance. So there are two ways to look at why only the human realm is suitable to tread the Dharma. One is that all the other realms don't have the right mix of pleasure and pain, of ease and pain. The hell realm, you've got so much pain, can't possibly tread the path to the Dharma. You're just busy trying to survive, and deal with the pain. And in the God realm, you've got so little pain, who would want to bother with treading the path of the Dharma, sitting cross-legged on a cushion? Because everything they see is beautiful, everything they hear is gorgeous music, everything they smell is perfume, and they make love with a glance, and just everything is pleasure. Only humans have enough suffering to motivate them to want to tread the path, and enough intelligence to be able to do it. Animals don't have enough intelligence. They're too pointedly fixed. Their response range is limited. And there's another way. When you get into the teachings on the subtle body, what goes to make up this body inside, with the channels and the chakras, bindus, only human beings have the adequate apparatus inside to be able to tread the path to enlightenment. All the other beings lack one thing or another. And so you really want to head to that blue light. And more than that, you want to head within the blue light to a family that is oriented towards the Dharma. And there are 4 continents that you would see if you're heading towards the human realm. And only the southern continent is the one that you want, because that's where the Dharma is practiced. The other the other 3 Dharma is not practiced. These are from the traditional Hindu, geography that was adopted by the Buddhists, where there's a central island, Jambudvipa, and then there are continents around it, and then there are islands around that, and it's all flat. It's a flat world. So he says that at the time of taking birth, or when we're just about to take rebirth, we'll experience the arisings of intense emotions, especially passion and jealousy, and that this coincides with the experience of witnessing our parents copulating. Hopefully they're not a couple of dogs. that you're witnessing human beings. And we're blinded by our desire. And that this is actually is the precipitating event for rebirth, is sexual desire. Because you watch your parents copulating, you can see them. And if you're attracted to the female, you're going to enter the woman's womb as a man, as a male child. And if you're attracted to the male, you're going to enter the woman's womb as a female child. And the precipitating event is sexual desire. You want to participate in that. We are blinded by desire. It says, what happens at this point is that the energy of the three root kleshas, that's passion, aggression, and ignorance, intensifies. As passion and aggression escalate, we fall further and further into a state of ignorance until we do not know who or where we are. This is all in the Bardo of becoming. However, at this time we can stop the momentum of rebirth through the different methods of practice in which we have trained. If you've trained in shamatha vipassana, which is what we were doing tonight, you can stop it by coming present, coming out of desire, out of the realm of thought. If you've practiced deity yoga, you can do it by seeing the world as sacred and not as this veil of tears, samsaric veil of tears. He also talks about relying on the Hinayana practices of renunciation. I think that's going to be the hardest pull of all. Those are the beginning practices where what you do, for instance, that one of the classic practices of renunciation would be you deal with sexual desire by visualizing the object of your desire, and stripping away the skin, seeing the flesh, the muscles, the tendons, the lymph, the blood, the organs. It becomes very disgusting. The idea is that you create disgust and you repress or you renounce sexual desire. And you can do this with all of the emotions in one way or another. You repress them. This is sort of the very beginning approach. Monks do this. Nuns do this, especially in the so-called Hinayana traditions. Later, it becomes more of an awareness practice where you see the emotion arising, and by not accepting or rejecting, remember, that means you don't follow the emotion, nor do you try and kick it out, but you welcome it, and as you do, you bring awareness to it, see it with some mild curiosity even, and welcoming. That doesn't mean you follow it, and it will self-liberate, unfortunately. That means it just evaporates, goes poof. He says we can also apply the Vipassana methods of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, great perfection. These are Vipassana, what we do here. At the very least, we can slow the process of rebirth and inject into it a degree of mindfulness and awareness that will allow us to examine the qualities of the parents and the location and determine the potential to practice Dharma that a particular birth will afford. Okay. Talks about creation and completion stages, but I don't think anybody here is doing any of that practice. Cliff? No? Nope. So I'm not going to go into that. That's deity yoga practice, using the visualizations that I mentioned earlier. It's called creation and completion practices. And the creation stage, you generate the visualization of the deity in front of you, yourself as the deity as well. The whole world is the mandala of a sacred world. And then in the end, you do the completion stage, which is you dissolve it back into perfect, clear awareness. He says, the end of this chapter. The point here, however, is do not be afraid of being who you are in any moment. This is so important. Or under any circumstances. So you don't reject what's going on in your mind when you meditate. Don't be hard on yourself. That is the message of the teachings of the Buddha Dharma, whether they are Hinayana, Mahayana, or Vajrayana. Therefore, the practice of all three yanas, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, is the practice of coming back to the present moment over and over. Discussion?
I have a question. So you mentioned 4 levels of wrath that deities cut through. So and you said about 4th one. So what about the rest?
The first 3?
Yeah.
I can't really remember the description of them, but they're varying levels of neurosis. Passion, klesha, defilement. The 3 root defilements are passion, aggression, and ignorance. And then, those proliferate and combine into the 5 or 6 other passions, hatred, envy, jealousy, desire, I'm just going through the realms, ignorance, and hunger, and then finally hatred and fear. And in the Buddha realms, there are only 5, but when Buddha families, there are five of those, but in the realms, there are 6. And the other 3 levels have to do with being caught in those passions and everything that underlies them. So fundamentally, the belief in I and other, of course, that's the root cause of all klesha altogether. And then the way in which it proliferates. And what the different levels of wrath are the manifestation of wisdom called forth by the intensity of ignorance. And a friend of mine was teaching at one time, and he gave the example of what constitutes wrathful wisdom. And he said it's like, why are these beings wrathful? Why are they, they got fangs, and they're black, and they're wielding swords, and, their eyes are rolling and bloodshot, and they don't look anything like human beings. And, some of them. And they're frightening looking, demons. And he said, it's like a mother standing on a street, on a curb with her toddler, and the child begins to step off into traffic, and she screams, "Get back!" like that, and grabs him. That's the wrath of the wrathful deity. But interestingly, when you meet the 100 peaceful and wrathful deities in the Bardo of reality, it can be that the peaceful ones are harder to look at than the wrathful ones, even though they're very, benign looking. Like, you know what a Buddha image looks like. Here we are. Because the thing is that they're shining with such incredible brilliance and intensity that it can be hard to train one's eyes on them. Whereas the wrathful ones are a little softer. And you're enjoined again and again to realize, as in this Bardo, one of the instructions is that these are not separate from you, but they are projections of mind. And there's even a description of how these are projected in the subtle body, that they come out of channels through the eyes and are actually, they appear as though they're out there, but they're actually like a movie projection that's being projected out through these channels. And we're enjoined again and again not to take them as being an I-other situation, because if you do, then everything goes awry.
And the peaceful deities are like Tara. Like what are the examples of peaceful?
The Buddha, Shakyamuni, but Avalokiteshvara, Amitabha, Ratnasambhava, Vajrasattva. Akshobhya. There are a lot of peaceful deities.
John, maybe I misunderstood you, but I thought in a past talk you said that the Aliyah dies with the physical body. And tonight you were saying that the Aliyah influences our experience in the bardos of reality and becoming. So can you offer any clarification? Did I misunderstand you?
Yeah. The Aliyah doesn't die. But what's stored in it becomes of no account for a brief moment, at the moment of death, when all of the mental events that might come out of the Aliyah collapse into the heart center. And there are the three kinds, passion, aggression, and ignorance. And for a moment, the Aliyah is of no more, for an instant, of no more concern, because reality is revealed. But then it begins to come back, and these thoughts begin to regenerate. It's the same thing. It happens to us all the time in daily life. It's just we don't notice it. But sometimes you do, where there's a moment of incredible clarity and presence. It's like a jolt of coming present and seeing something, the world, oneself, in a moment of intense ease and clarity. The mind has shut down, the thinking mind, and the clear mind, the mind of knowing, is all that's left. That's even a negative way of putting it. It becomes evident. But then the Aliyah, you see, there's two versions of the Aliyah Jnana and the Aliyah Vijnana. Mostly when they talk about the Aliyah Jnana, they just talk about the Aliyah, and they don't use the Jnana term. But Ponlop Rinpoche does. He calls it the Aliyah Jnana. The fundamental Aliyah, or the Aliyah Jnana, is another name for reality. It's this space which is generative, out of which everything arises and into which everything passes. It never stops, that generation. And all that changes with enlightenment is that we realize there is no thing that is arising and passing away. Nothing has any true existence. It's all like images on a computer screen. Or that's a modern analogy. In the traditional analogy, they say it's like images in a mirror or reflections on water. All of the way these six knowables, objects of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental events, they arise and pass away in the Aliyah. They're like images in a mirror, reflections on water. They have no substance, and yet they appear. That's that thing I always love, that slogan that sometimes you chant in tantric practice. It says, things do not exist, and yet they arise. They arise, and yet they don't exist. That's the Aliyah Jnana. The Aliyah Vijnana is the eighth consciousness of neurotic, confused mind. There are the eight objects. There's the consciousness of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. And there's the consciousness of mind, which sees mental events. That's 6. There's the defiled consciousness, which we come back to. And then there's the Aliyah consciousness, which is the storehouse. That's the unconscious, where everything is stored. And the 7th consciousness, which is called the defiled consciousness, Klishto Mano Vijnana. It looks back at the Aliyah and says, that's me. So we walk through our lives having this vague sense of our history, our past. And that we say, that's I. That's the continuity of I. I know that I'm there. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. Although I do have one more question. Do I understand correctly that the Aliyah Vijnana is present in the Bardo of reality?
No.
It's not.
It's not.
Oh, okay.
No. The Alaya Vijnana is an illusion. It's part
Yeah,
of,
that's why I'm
it's
asking.
part of
It
neurotic
didn't make
mind.
sense.
It's part of ego mind,
Okay.
which has no true existence. It's just a mistake. It's like saying, my hand is green. It's not true. That's what all of ego mind, including the Alaya Vijnana, is like that. I once asked Trungpa Rinpoche if ego mind, including the Alaya Vijnana, didn't sort of exist provisionally, you sort of need it to get through the day, balance your checkbook, pick up the milk, whatever, And he was sitting where I'm sitting now, and he leaned forward like this and into the microphone, and he bellowed, "Ego is a lie." A lie. He wasn't pulling punches. He wasn't saying it's a mistake, something polite like that. It's
Okay,
pernicious.
thanks. Anyone else?
A question about when you were talking about the Bardo becoming and viewing the parents copulating. Attracted to one and the other. It's a very binary view. And I was wondering, any thoughts, what if one is attracted to both?
I have no idea.
How does it
what
go
about,
beyond
what
that?
about the new gender fluidity and all of that? I have no idea how that works. Huh? What?
Intersexuality, intersects everything.
Yeah. No, I don't know. We need teaching on this. We need somebody smarter than me. I think, this is coming out of very traditional contexts, and so it just isn't dealt with. But I'd like to hear it. Yeah, it's important. I'm not sure. It's really interesting. We should ask some really smart teacher about this. Maybe Ponlo Rinpoche knows, or maybe he could say something about it, how that takes place. Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. Years ago, Trungpa Rinpoche looked at us and he said, "You'll be dropping like flies." And I was probably 25 at the time. And now I'm 75, 50 years later. And it is happening. People are dying around me. And the funny thing is, I could say some of these deaths are very unexpected and sudden. And yet the teachings tell us death is real, comes without warning. So even when a person is sick, I've got a dear loved one in my family who's been dying of cancer, or has been struggling with cancer for 24 years. Stage 4 for the past 7. On the other hand, my friend David Gurevich, who, by the way, contributed the money that got us incorporated and with a tax-exempt status at New York Buddha Dharma, back when we first started. 63 years old, primal life, a successful criminal and criminal lawyer, and also worked for the AG's office in New York at different times. He liked to go back and forth, as he put it, from the good guys to the bad guys. He liked working for the good guys, but the bad guys were where you made the money. So he had to work for the bad guys. And he said of them, when I first met him, he came to me as a coaching client because he was tired of working for the bad guys and he wanted to go do some good work, and he was having a lot of difficulty because at the time the good guys, the Attorney General's offices, just weren't prosecuting the bad guys the way they had in the past because of the current that administration. So he wanted coaching. And he said of his clients, "I know they're crooks. They know I know they're crooks." But he made a lot of money defending them, and they were entitled to a defense. So David was a very close friend. I'd say we had dinner a couple times a month, and talked on the phone a little more than that. And I just had a lot of affection for him, and he was sort of sometime interested in Buddhist stuff. Did some Shambhala training levels at the Shambhala Center in New York. And in the beginning, he used to come here. He had a place in the country, out in Pennsylvania, on a lake. And David had divorced about 10 years ago, and he was dating a lot of women. And he was always asking me to come out to that country place, maybe bring, the woman that I'm dating, living with. And I never got around to it. And one day, about, how long ago? A little over 49 days now. His ex-wife, called me and told me that a girlfriend had come to his house in the morning. She was due to see him. Arrived and found it burned to the ground with him in it. So you all, will have, and you do have, people in your lives who have died recently in the past, whatever. And so one of the things that you can do for these people is to do Tonglen for them. And what they say, by the way, is that a person in the Bardo is so much more aware and intelligent by virtue of having lost the body and being in this purely mental place, that your Tonglen practice will be heard in the Bardo and can have a big impact, a beneficial impact on that person. Although you, because you're still alive and in this body, won't even know it. So we do Tonglen for people like my friend David, who by this time, if he's following the course as it's laid out, has taken rebirth somewhere, and I hope in a human realm. Wow. And it's just going on a lot. We had a woman who was in one of my classes up in Westchester, and we have this Zoom group that meets in the mornings. Becca and Marie's been to that, and I don't know, Joe, have you been part of that Zoom group in the morning? No, yeah. Well, there was a person who was a regular. She was there 5 days a week. Her name was Romy Schechter, and she was about 63, about the same age as David, and she was in these classes, doing a lot of classes. She was an Israeli and pretty serious Jew, as well as being really into Buddhism. And she taught art. She was a wonderful artist herself, very successful, and she taught art to kids on Saturdays and Sundays, and those were the only days she didn't join our Zoom group. And one day, on a Saturday, she contracted the flu. This is before the coronavirus. This was about, must be 3 or 4 months ago now, at least. And she contracted the flu on a Saturday. Sunday it got worse. Monday her husband took her to the doctor and she died in the car. Perfectly normal, vital woman. So death is real, comes without warning. This body will be a corpse. Practice. And do Tonglen for people when they die, because maybe they'll be able to hear you. Yes. Maybe one more and then we'll...
Will you ever feel ready for death? Like, is it possible to feel ready for death?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, they talk in the teachings about teachers or people who achieve some degree of realization who go into death no problem. Trungpa Rinpoche loved Suzuki Roshi. Suzuki Roshi was the master of Zen Center. He adored him. And I think Roshi pretty much adored Trungpa Rinpoche too. They loved each other. And Roshi died, of course, about 1971, I think, 71 or 72. When he died, Rinpoche said, "I've lost my only friend in North America. I witnessed the two of them. I was traveling with Rinpoche a lot in those days. And we would go to California, and we'd go to visit Roshi at Zen Center in San Francisco, once at Tassajara. And that was a momentous visit for Trungpa Rinpoche. It gave birth to a lot of forms that he invented, like Datun, Weektun, the Weektun we want to do. You know, he invented that after seeing Sesshin at Tassajara. That's a month-long, you know this, right? And he adored Roshi. When Roshi died, Rinpoche went to see him just before he died in the hospital. And he came back, and we were sitting around, and someone asked him, how is Roshi? And Rinpoche said, he's dying like a true Buddhist. And someone, I can't remember who, asked, what does that mean, dying like a true Buddhist? And Rinpoche said, he's curious about his own death. And there are lots of stories of teachers going into death joyfully. The Karmapa, the 16th Karmapa, we now have the 17th, was dying in a hospital in Chicago. My friend Don Milani was attending him, and Don described he was sitting on the floor on a cushion next to the bed. The Karmapa was asleep, he thought. And Don was crying. And suddenly he felt a hand on his head, and he looked up, and the Karmapa was smiling down at him, and he said, don't worry, nothing happens. So the thing is, you see, how do we understand this? The way we understand this is that the courage to be like that is beyond courage. You know, it's not like you're dealing with fear. Courage usually implies you're pushing fear away or somehow conquering it. This is beyond that. This is the way to understand it is resting your mind in reality, in the present moment, now. Letting it all, every thought, every emotion, every arising of a visual percept or a sound, or come and go, and seeing it. Not rejecting or clinging to anything, but seeing it all and being there for it, and being ready to participate, ready to respond with openness of heart and mind. I think that's the key. They talk about lots of teachers going into death joyfully. People who have achieved some realization. Yes?
I've always kind of had a curiosity that...
What?
I've always had a curiosity that Tibetan Buddhism is so specific about the stages of death and rebirth. And to my knowledge, other Buddhisms don't really treat with that sort of specificity. And I don't know if you could address that.
Why is it that Tibetan Buddhism deals with this, but Chinese or Zen or, Theravada don't? It could be, and I'll just make a supposition. It could have to do with the way Buddhism moved out of India. You see, Buddhism left India, starting around, probably around the 3rd century, as near as we can tell, BC. And it went south into Southeast Asia through Ceylon. And the schools that went south were what the Tibetans call the Hinayana schools. And the main one of which was a school in the Sanskrit. It was called the Slaviravada. And in the Pali, it comes out Theravada. Thera and Slavira both mean the same thing. You can see how close they are. Sanskrit and Pali are very close. They mean elder. So Vada means doctrine. So it's the doctrine of the elders. They were so-called the period of the 18 schools. The Sangha fractured after the Buddha's death over a period of a few hundred years into what were called the 18 schools, only a handful of which survived. One, the Mahasangikas, they're called the Greater Sangha school, became the Mahayana, supposedly. A school called the Doctrine That Everything Exists, the Sarvastivada, went north into Tibet. But what happened was, you see, that meanwhile, Buddhism was kept evolving in India over the centuries. Buddhism never stands still. That's because there's no book. There is no creed. There is no primal doctrine which is immutable, like there is the Bible or the Quran. Buddhism is very clear, that the teachings of Buddhism are simply useful ways to take things. They're not written in gold letters. And so it keeps changing and evolving over the centuries, and people achieve enlightenment, and they come out with new teachings. And the tantric teachings, nobody knows for sure, because a lot of this is prehistoric, literally. I mean, there wasn't a printing press. People didn't start actually copying sutras until maybe sometime in the prehistoric, BC times, pre-Christian era. And even then, they were copying by hand, so it was very, very limited, the ability to copy and distribute sutras. So a lot of it, that's why there's so many mnemonic devices in Buddhism, the 5 of these, the 6 of those, 10 of the others. It's a way of helping people remember the teachings, because they had to. That was the only way you could pass them along. They had to memorize them. So at some point, probably nobody knows for sure, but scholars, Western scholars, guess sometime in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries A.D., Tantrism, Buddhist Tantrism, was developing in the forests. Forest yogis, wild people, ashes on their bodies and naked and, performing tantric rituals. It was the Buddhism constantly co-opted the Hindu tradition and changed it into a non-dual teaching. And that goes for Tantrism. Tantrism came out of the Hindu tradition and was adopted and transmogrified by Buddhists. At some point around the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries, Tantrism came out of the forests and it went into the monasteries and the great universities. Nalanda University, Vikramashila, Udantapuri. These are the 3 big universities in India. They were huge. I visited the remains of Nalanda. You can go there in Bihar, the province of Bihar. And when you go there, what they've done, the Indian government has begun archaeological digs, and they find buildings, and they recreate the foundation and the walls up to about 3 or 4 feet, so you can see where the buildings were. And my guide stood there, and we were standing in the middle of some of these buildings, and he pointed to the horizon. He said, it went all the way there to the horizon. There were supposedly 10,000 monks in residence in Nalanda. So Tantrism came and into the universities in around the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. Buddhism went to Tibet from India, starting around the 7th century. At least that's the traditional history. Under the, what was his name, King Songtsen Gampo in the 7th century, around 626. The Tibetans didn't even have a written language. Songtsen Gampo, the king, what he had is he married a bunch of wives, polygamy. And one of his wives, at least, was a Chinese princess and a Buddhist, and she converted him into Buddhism. So he wanted to bring Buddhism from India, and he sent for teachers, and he sent one of his ministers to India to bring back a written language so they could write down the texts. His name was Tonmi Sambuddha, this guy. And he went to India and he brought back the Sanskrit alphabet, which they adapted to the Tibetan language. Much the way we use the same alphabet for French or German or Spanish. Just sounds different. And what went to Tibet from India, from these tantric teachings in the universities, were, among other things, the teachings about death. Now, Buddhism left India for Southeast Asia before the Christian era, 8th century, 6th, 7th centuries earlier. It left for China, and from China to Japan and Korea and Mongolia at the time of Christ. That's when Buddhism made the transition across, and it took a long time for Buddhism to get established in China, because one of the problems was the language barrier was immense. The difference between Chinese and Sanskrit is enormous. They're at opposite ends of the linguistic spectrum. You know, Chinese is utterly uninflected. Sanskrit is one of the most inflected languages in the world. Inflection means you take a root, like let's say one, by, B-U-Y, and you that's the root word. And by modifying the root, you achieve different meanings. So, bought, past tense, has bought, have bought, will buy, will have bought. These are all inflections of the root word bought, buy. Some languages inflect nouns. Latin does. When you begin to learn Latin, you've got, 6 or 8 endings for every noun. Nominative, genitive, dative, ablative, in both singular and plural. And so the noun, which is the root, like farmer, agricola in Latin, right? It's the first word you ever learn in Latin, agricola. Agricolae means farmers, apostrophe S. Agricolam means the farmer whose butt you kicked. It's the accusative case. Sanskrit has this to the nth degree. The articulation of these kinds of subtleties of meaning and changing a root. Chinese, 0. None. It's utterly uninflected. You want to say, I went to the store? You say, I go to, no articles, store yesterday. Put a time word on it. There are no articles. Well, there are. There's this and that. But there's no the or a or an. Right? It's an utterly cut down spirit thing. So it had Chinese, Buddhism had a huge transition from India to China. It took 400 years before they started getting accurate translations. They had terrible translations of the Indian Buddhist texts in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries A.D. And then from there, it went to Japan. So what went to Japan was early Buddhism filtered through China, same thing for Mongolia and Korea, and it didn't have this Tantrism that had been developing in India, because now a little bit of Tantrism did go to China, and it also made it to Japan in the form of Shingon Buddhism. But it's not nearly as developed as what went to Tibet. Tibet got the full download from India. They got everything. All these guys came from Tibet, like Marpa, the translator, and a bunch of others, and they took back the teachings. They wanted everything. So that's my guess about why only the Tibetans have these Bardo teachings. That's just a guess. I could be wrong. But you don't find Tantrism much, very little, in Chinese or Zen Buddhism. And Trungpa Rinpoche, this is interesting, when he went to, God, I'm going on too long. When he went to visit Suzuki Roshi, one of the things he wanted to talk about was the superiority of Tibetan Buddhism to Zen. Now, he never put it that way, okay? But what he felt was that Zen got stuck on prajna, and they didn't get on into completely non-dual wisdom, which is what jnana is all about. And so he always wanted to talk about the difference between prajna and jnana, and he would rehearse it with us before we got there. Huh? I
would love to have heard those comments.
Oh my God. And then the two of them would sit there and in front of, and surrounded by students, right, in the zendo. Or in a hall, like a reception hall, little. It wasn't the zendo because that was too big. We were in this other hall, and he would have a bunch of students around him. Roshi had his, and maybe Rinpoche had half a dozen at most, whatever showed up, and they would talk. And Roshi talked in this very heavily accented Japanese English, and Rinpoche talked in this Oxonian Tibetan accented English. And I'm sitting here thinking, do these guys understand what each one's saying? And they seem to be just having a great time. Yeah, it was terrific. Well, we should end. And we have some things to talk about. So can we end this recording? And we'll, wait, before we do that, let's do the dedication.